Okay, so we have Jeff Kopaska, here. He's also from the DNR. He is a fisheries biometrician, but he said he was really a fisheries biomagician earlier to me. So he's a graduate from ISU. He has an MS in ecology and evolutionary biology. Prior to working with the DNR, he was a research assistant in the limnology lab at ISU, managing the statewide lake water quality sampling efforts and lake and watershed restoration planning. His areas of interest are water quality, land use impacts on aquatic systems, historic conditions of Iowa's lakes and rivers, and restoration of Iowa's lakes and rivers. So, I'll let you take over.
Thank you. Everything good? Everybody back there? Perfect. So the good news for you folks is if you got a copy of the Getting into Land and Water little magazine they were handing out, there's a story at the end of that written by some goofball that talks about historic conditions and stuff like that about rivers and streams in Iowa. You get the picture version now. And it's kind of funny, I'm a statistician, so I'm here kind of just telling you a story and not giving a super technical talk. Like I only have one slide that has like stats or anything like that. And then the book writer just gave the technical talk. We do things great at DNR, kind of all backwards. But. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is what were Iowa's streams and rivers like a long time ago, and what should we think about as we're doing restoration work. And one of the kind of many hats that I wear is I'm like the unofficial historian of the Fisheries Bureau. So I got sent some pictures a number of years ago, or about a year ago, that were taken in the early 1900s of Iowa's rivers and streams. I'm going to show those to you here in just a little bit. But let's start with some historical context. This is the cover of a book written by Albert Lee. You might have heard of him. He's got a town named after him. Anyway, the alternate title of this is How Iowa Got Its Name. So he was part of the Dragoons that did the initial, figuring out what's going on here in Iowa, and he wrote a book about it. Wrote that in 1836 about some investigations he'd done prior to that. What he said about our land here: transparent waters perpetually renewed by the springs from which they flow. Interesting. Their supply of water is remarkably uniform throughout the seasons. Doesn't sound much like Iowa streams today. The Des Moines River, 80 to 100 yards wide, shallow, crooked, filled with rocks, sandbars, etc. Perfectly smooth, a little bit of sand and gravel over the rock in the bottom. And John Olson said he was looking at the Des Moines River in Des Moines when they were doing some of the work on one of the bridges there. And even now you can see the big limestone boulders when the water levels go down. The Iowa River, that's the water comes from the Des Moines Lobe, a lot of those lakes up there. The river is perennially supplied with pure and limpid water. Current is rapid, etc. So, and the fish, there can never be any scarcity of the fish in these rivers. Every stream is filled with them. Filled with pike, pickerel, catfish, trout, etc. And they didn't really do hook and line fishing back then, so at the rapids they could be easily speared. Had to eat, so that's how they got their food. Anyway, Iowa River just up north of here by Belmond. Much vegetation in the river. How many interior Iowa rivers have a lot of vegetation today? None. And the pickerel seem quite plentiful in the grass. Interesting, really cool stuff. Now these are all qualitative, not much quantitative stuff going on, but there wasn't a whole lot of quantitative going on back then. In fact, the first quantitative surveys of Iowa's rivers occurred in the 1890s. And as you're aware, we became a state in 1846. A lot of the intensification of agriculture was happening in 1830 to 1860. That's when things kind of started changing a little bit in our streams. But these, I think, are some of the very first photographs, or some of the oldest photographs that we have available of what Iowa's rivers and streams look like. So Arthur Whedon was doing a master's project at the University of Iowa. And he was looking at odonata, dragonflies. And he did his research up at Lakeside Lab. So he'd go from Iowa City up to Lakeside Lab. And in addition to what he was doing up there, he liked to hang out in the rivers. So in 1909, he got in a canoe up north of Dow's and he floated the Iowa River all the way from there to Iowa City. And so he took some photographs. So this is the Iowa River at Dow's in 1909. A few miles below Dow's at the same month, and then on down by Alden. A couple years prior, he did some work similarly along the Little Sioux River just south of the Lakeside Lab in the Cherokee area. So some photos that he took of what he called Greens Creek, but what locally today is Grays Creek, in 1907. And the rapids on Mill Creek just north of Cherokee, and then also the Little Sioux River. So a lot of erosion, you can see a lot of trees. There was a huge flooding event in 1905 to 1904 on the Little Sioux River. So I think what we're seeing here is a lot of that damage that had occurred at that time, and still a lot of large woody debris in the river. So we also have some other historical comments that we can look at. Kegley, whom Kegley Branch, just north of Ames here, is named after, wrote this about his childhood, which roughly occurred in the mid-1800s. The banks bordering the river were not very high. Either side was a bottomland, heavily timbered, perhaps heavenly also, with a lot of trees. Well, that's what it looks like now. You can see that this bottomland is not very heavily timbered. In fact, it's pretty heavily crop fielded. But that's what that area looks like today. And then let's move toward the middle of the 19th century. There was a kind of a review of what a fisheries in Iowa looked like, written by Speaker and Bailey. They were in charge of what was the fisheries folks in Iowa at that time. And some of the comments they had: soil erosion control and water conservation. Lakes and streams of Iowa have been greatly damaged by uncontrolled erosion, banks and watershed. Probably the most serious menace to our fish. And stream ditching, widely practiced, also really bad for fish. A whole lot of words there, really bad for fish. But pollution control by the mid-19th century had gotten a lot better. In fact, but prior to this, the farmers were complaining to their elected officials about they couldn't let their cattle drink from the rivers and streams because of all the pollution, the sewage, coming from the cities and towns in Iowa and dumping into the streams, because it would just get dumped straight in there. So actually, by the middle of the century, we were seeing some substantial improvements in water quality just because we weren't dumping raw sewage in there anymore. So that's kind of where we were and how we got there. Where are we now? Okay. Well, I see Keith in the back. Thanks for the slide, Keith. Raccoon River TSS. Keith and Chris Jones have been doing a lot of work looking at some of that Des Moines Waterworks data. This is what they've determined for suspended sediment loads in the Raccoon River in Des Moines, looking from 1900 to now, and we can see a drastic drop in the amount of sediment that's moving along in that river compared to historical conditions. So since about the 1930s, when we were dealing with the Dust Bowl, we've done a lot of conservation practices. That's doing a great job of today keeping a lot more soil in the fields than was running off and subject to erosion a long time ago. But all that initial conversion that was happening from the 1860s to about the 1930s gave us what we call legacy sediment. So Iowa's streams in the mid-1800s kind of looked like what we have up on top there. And a description is like this. Between the watersheds at distances of 2 or 3 miles, there were these little clear brooks with banks of black sod, the prairie grasses just overarching the streams, and a little a little stream like you see up there, and you can see the pebbles on the bottom and things like that. But then we got all this deposition of sediment into the floodplains. That happened between the 1860s and 1930s. And here's a description written by Seth Meek in the 1890s about what his observations and what he'd heard regarding the streams that he was out there checking out the fish in. Originally, the prairie, during heavy rains, the sod absorbed the water. We didn't get our rivers pounded. Streams were also relieved from drying up. I've been informed that many streams, formerly deep and narrow, like the top, in abounding in fish, have grown wide and shallow, like we see in the second description there. All right. Then, from the time that the soil conservation really started until about the 1980s, what we saw was these shallow and wider dropping at least on the Des Moines lobe to the original stream bottoms that we have today. We don't see much degradation. Those streams are just hitting those hard cobbles and stuff like that left over from the glaciation. So the stream bottom isn't any deeper, but they look so deep and incised and bad today because of all this aggraded sediment that has been deposited in our floodplains. Now, that aggraded sediment not only is a lot of dirt right next to the stream, but it's also a whole lot of phosphorus. Phosphorus travels with sediment to a great degree, so what we have is this huge storehouse of sediment and phosphorus sitting right next to our streams. And then from 1980s to current, we've kind of widened those out because we're just not seeing that much more movement of sediment off of the hilltops and into the valleys, at least not, in comparison to what we saw in the early 1900s. All right, so some recent assessments. Tomer, in his work on looking at the South Fork of the Iowa River, estimates that we've had historically about 70 tons per acre of soil loss in that watershed. And Philstrup and Downing and Heathcote also saw 70 tons per acre lost from the watersheds into our lakes. So on the Des Moines lobe, the most tabletop flat part of the state, we're still seeing historically around 70 tons per acre of soil loss. Most of that has either ended up in the lakes or it's in these river valleys. And that's from the Des Moines lobe. If we look at the other parts of the state, there's probably a whole lot worse in those hillier areas. So this is what that looks like. The stream bottom is down here. Pre-settlement soil surface is here, and we've got all this historical sediment and all this reserve of phosphorus sitting right next to our streams, ready to get eroded at the next flooding event. All right, so what's the current status of our fish habitat? Well, in a stream like this, it's not too awesome. But at a national scale, I've been part of what's called the National Fish Habitat Partnership, National Fish Habitat Initiative, and we did a nationwide assessment of fish habitat. And it resulted in this map. And the darker reds are where our fish habitat is in a little bit more trouble, and the risk of degradation is the highest. It was all remotely sensed, and specifically here in Iowa, the things that made us a little more red are highly cultivated cropland use and a lot of nutrient and sediment pollution in our streams. And this is what Iowa looks like, at least according to the remotely sensed data. Not a huge surprise, we got some urban centers that are not great for fish habitat, and then a lot of stuff throughout the landscape too. Well, it's not just this remotely sensed data that tells us we've got a few issues going on. One of my coworkers, Greg Gelwicks, he's our river and stream research biologist, did a statewide assessment, and 67% of river substrates across the state are either sand or silt. Not the bigger, better fish habitat, cobble, things like that, silt and sand. And over 40% of the stream banks in Iowa have no vegetation. They're just completely bare banks. And then, some other areas that have a little bit of vegetation, but still quite susceptible to erosion events. So that's not so great. Like I said before, Keith's slide, some water quality parameters are getting better, like that sediment reduction, at least in suspended solids. But fish and fish habitat aren't. So what's up with that? Well, it's kind of about the watershed and how streams function. The base of the pyramid is hydrology. How does water get from the watershed to the channel? Hydraulics, how does it move in the channel and on the floodplain? Geomorphology, a lot of that sediment stuff. Then you get to water quality, physiochemical, and finally the fish, way up at the top of the pyramid. And remember, fun happens at the top of the pyramid. Fish are fun. All right, so we're talking a lot about different restoration things that we're doing here. And the nutrient reduction strategy is one of the things we're doing for restoration. You're very aware it's designed to reduce nutrient inputs to surface water, and we want to see a 45% reduction. So what's that look like? Right there, 45% in nitrogen and phosphorus export. Oops, sorry. So here we have Iowa. I'm sure you're familiar. We got the rivers on both sides. Basically, we got a big faucet on each side, and phosphorus. If you've ever struck a match, the red on the end is phosphorus. So we have our phosphorus loss in red, our nitrogen loss in green, and what we want to do is make that smaller. Now, actually, I was at the Nancy Wrigley talk the other night, and one person asked, could we just put a big reverse osmosis filter out there and remove all the nitrate, you know? And I was like, there's a lot of water in Mississippi. That might, you know, but I think that really is, people would love to see a technological solution like that, so we could just keep doing what we're doing on the landscape and not change. So I was surprised, but I wasn't too surprised. Anyway, so where should we start thinking about restoration? Well, right now what we're thinking about is reducing nitrogen and phosphorus, and that's way up there. And if we want to see improvements in fish, that's going to happen way up there. But how are we going to improve fish habitat and really improve fish? Well, we kind of got to start down here if we want to have fun at the top of the pyramid. So, just a little bit of information. What does our hydrology look like? How does water get from the watershed to the stream? Well, often this is how water gets from the watershed to the stream, and that's not the best. How about hydraulics? How does it move? Well, a lot of times our hydraulics look like this, and this is an illustration of Squaw Creek, and you can see the changes in channels over time from the 1930s to about 2000 up there. And this is a typical Iowa stream. We've got chocolate milk there in the middle, and we've got a little bit of riparian vegetation between it and the corn. But we don't always have riparian vegetation between it and the field, as is illustrated here. People a lot smarter about corn than me in here. This has got to be, what, less than 2 months after planting? And we've lost a good 10, 12 feet from the stream bank there. And most of the time, I don't think that the farmer would actually want to go that close to the stream, because it's like a $250,000 tractor that they don't want dumped in the river. But you know, sometimes the machinery does end up in the river, and that's not such a good thing. All right, so the Iowa angle, we're trying to fix water quality, but we're not necessarily trying to improve things for fish. Our strategy doesn't really address the alterations that we've had to stream functions like hydrology, hydraulics, and geomorphology. And if we don't account for these ecosystem issues, we're not going to make a lot of progress for fish or fish habitats, the biology, the fun at the top of the pyramid. So, getting back to the Kegley Branch, again, that's what it looked like in the winter. I went out there, took some pictures. It said that the banks were really close. You didn't have to go very far down the bank to get to the stream. Well, this right here is Kegley Branch coming into the Skunk River, and that's at least 6 foot high. And if you've ever been out there, there's this big floodplain going back. In fact, I'll show you a couple more pictures. So it's a high bank. A lot of sediment moving in this system. Anywhere there's like a tree or something, you get a lot of sediment deposition behind that. And this is the other side of the river where we have about a 12 to 15 foot cut bank. So not quite the easy access. We've probably had some of that historical alluvial deposit right here. Probably not the 15 feet, but at least the 6 feet on the other side of the river. And this This is where the Kegley Branch comes in, and this whole area back to the road is really flat and has had a lot of deposition of sediments over time since the first picture was taken in the 1930s. So this is where we get into kind of the fun. I went back and found everywhere, at least as close as I thought I could find, where those streams pictures were taken in the early 1900s. So here we have the Iowa River at Dow's comparison photo, and the aerial photo. This picture was taken right in there. And I'm just going to show you some of the changes over time, or not changes over time. They actually, for the most part, these look quite similar. And this one at Alden, it does look a lot different. The dam at Alden, the Lowhead Dam, was built in 1932, so we have a whole lot more water in that area now than we had in the early 1900s. And you can see the 1930s photo had the dam in there as well. Grays Creek, very similar looking, but, and it's in this area, quite similar, a little more sinuosity now than before, which is cool. But we also have like this 6-foot cut bank right next to the stream. The rapids on Milk Creek, can't see the rapids there very much, but it's still the same goat prairie up above. And as we move along, a lot of, open area, unvegetated stream bank. A lot of that erodible sediment right there. Little Sioux River. And got some corn in the stream there. Little beaver work, I think. This is very interesting, how much that river has migrated. And that's why we have all of this riprap along here, is because they're wanting to protect that road. The road that they put in the early 1900s was very susceptible to getting blown away. And again, it's kind of similar. You look at one bank to the other from a century ago to now. But I'm standing there this past September. It hadn't rained in about a month and a half. And I am shin deep, and I can't see my boots in a foot of water. That's not great. But there's a lot of loess soils up there that are highly erodible, stays turbid quite a bit of the year. So where are we at today? We've got a whole lot of sediment and phosphorus sitting right next to the stream, readily erodible at the next high flow event. And we don't really have much of a plan to tie up those sources via coordinated riparian restoration efforts. But if we were to tie up those sediments next to the stream, some interesting things can happen. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, we got to put in, Dick Schultz buffer strip too. So they did a bunch of work on the South Fork of the Iowa River after the '08 floods, and getting down to the third point here, if there was just some permanent vegetation alongside the stream and the stream banks, a lot less erosion without even having to do the full-blown, restoration. Now, that'd be even better. But what they found is a lot less soil loss, and the riparian management could be awesome, especially considering that like 80% of the phosphorus in our streams is from stream bank erosion, 40 to 80%. All right, let's talk about another place where there's not much sediment. Lake Delhi. Lake Delhi had a fantastic smallmouth fishery, probably the best smallmouth fishery in the state of Iowa, right below the dam. Why was that? Well, the dam on the Kopaska River captured pretty much all the sediment. So what we had was an average depth of about 3/4 of a meter, 85% coarse substrates, and a width to depth ratio of 49 in our baseline status for smallmouth. Boom, great big flood event, blew out the dam. The stream got shallower, got a lot more embedded, fewer coarse substrates, more fine substrates, widened and not as deep, and a huge reduction in smallmouth. Now in 2016, 1 year after they put the dam back, so 1 year of let's stop sediment from getting into this place, we've already increased our average depth because the water is picking up the sediment that's accumulated there and cleaning up. A whole lot more coarse substrates. It's getting back to where it wants to be in terms of a width to depth ratio, and the bass are coming back. And that's only 1 year after the dam was put back. Now I'm not here to say, hey, let's put more dams on the river. I'm here to say, let's keep some of that sediment from getting into where the fish want to be. So, what are we trying to do? Where are we trying to go? We're kind of starting halfway up that pyramid with dealing with nitrogen and phosphorus. But the hydrology and the hydraulics are kind of broken and unstable. But if we stabilize the foundation, we have a better chance of actually seeing biological improvements at the top. So I'm not saying that we're going to fix the hydrology of Iowa. That is a huge challenge. Or even the hydraulics, although it'd be great for fish to be able to access the floodplains that they can't access right now. But I know that we can do things that will reduce sediment and improve fish habitat right along with the things we're doing for nitrogen and phosphorus. And if we do that, it will certainly improve things for the fish. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm along South Fork, and we fought that stream, most of my life because those banks are extremely unstable, and it's extremely expensive to stabilize them. What kind of things do you recommend as far as
I think
what ways to do very fast?
so. Here's the deal: it has to be coordinated, because for you to do anything at the bank where you are is very susceptible to getting blown out by the next event, because the person below you didn't do it and the person above you didn't do it, so yours is likely to get blown up. You got to start at the headwaters and progressively move this downstream if we want to be effective in the long haul. Because if you don't stabilize at the beginning, when those fingers are way up at the top of the watershed, it's not a waste, but it's less likely to be successful if you start in the middle of the stream versus on the upper end. It has to be coordinated. And that's not great with our mindset of do everything voluntarily with the nutrient reduction strategy. But if we don't do this in a coordinated fashion, it's not going to have the probability of as much success. Any other questions? Lunch is soon, so I don't want to keep you too long. We don't want to be the last ones in line. It may not be the last. Yes?
I guess, do you have a way to suggest that coordination?
I don't believe that I'm supposed to talk about that kind of stuff in this venue with my DNR hat. But I would say coordinated from the top down is much more likely to be successful. All right. Oh, yes, Clay.
Just curious if you know about other states that have faced similar challenges, and I know in your roles with AFS and other things, you probably talked to folks in other states. Do you have any success stories from other states, maybe other Midwestern states to share that might be useful here in Iowa?
I think you're all looking north. We simply look one state to the north. They have the required buffers on every mile of stream in the state of Minnesota and for every lake. I mean, they made a conscious effort, but they have a bit of a different natural resource mindset than we do. They value their fisheries very much because a lot of people fish in Minnesota. That's kind of their lifestyle, and a lot of people fish in Iowa too. I mean, somewhere between a fourth and a third of our population fishes, but it's different here. Yeah, Mike.
I think we have a lot of success stories in Iowa already that show that, especially in northeast Iowa where we work in our trout streams. And when we can tackle a smaller watershed and put in enough PMPs and bank stabilization, we've seen the fish in the habitat turn around and turn into fish. Follow. It's
right? And you know what? You don't walk a mile in one step. It's baby steps. And honestly, you have to tackle, what was the talk yesterday, wicked problems. You have to tackle them, intelligently. We have to take baby steps. We're just starting this journey.